Okay, well, thank you again for being here and for a wonderful presentation opening today. Now we're going to start our second session. Hope, Pragmatism, and the Object. So we'll have three presenters. Christopher Tong, who is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature and Asian Studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is also one of 11 early career fellows selected by the American Council of Learned Society and the Henry Luce Foundation in 2021. Our second will be Santhi Kavuri-Bauer, who teaches Islamic and Asian art at San Francisco State University. Her research interests are in these areas and also Asian American art. Her more recent research is concerned with wonder as an aesthetic sensation and how it informs the design and experience of Islamic monuments. Our final presenter will be Asma Kazmi, who is assistant professor at UC Berkeley, where she teaches video, performance art, new media, and drawing. And this conversation will be moderated by Janet Oh, who is assistant curator of contemporary art here at the Asian Art Museum. With that, I will invite Christopher to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Padma, and Janet and Alexa as well, and also the staff at the Asian Art Museum and its sponsors and partners for organizing this event. I just wanted to start by just giving you some background. I started working on this project about 2 years ago, and knowing what text I was going to talk about, but not knowing how the context would evolve. And over the past 2 years or so, the project has become more intellectually and personally meaningful for me because it was a way for me to think through the ongoing pandemic, what it means to survive it and to suffer loss, to think about the political and civic developments in the United States, the pro-democracy protests in Asia, and as well as what it means to belong to a place as an Asian American in this society. So, even though my own research focuses on the intersection of culture, politics, and the environment in the early 20th century in China and the United States, these poems actually work both on the level of the text, but also in intertextual ways that I wasn't quite anticipating, but those have evolved over time. So it started out with me thinking about hope. Hope is often evoked in narratives of revolution, migration, and resistance to oppression. The history of early 20th century China contains many of these narratives. However, there are moments in Chinese literary history when hope was not necessarily the obvious answer to the state of turmoil. And I wanted to talk about several poems that speak to this. These poems were written variously in China and the United States. They were also written in classical as well as modern Chinese, and by famous literati and unknown migrants. And these poems together, I argue, give us a sense of hope that is neither about the anticipation of success or disappointment, but rather a productive way to live life in the state of turbulence, but in a pragmatic way. So I'll just start with a thesis, the first one. The principle of hope tends to assume a sense of futurity. This sense of futurity is often teleological or eschatological. And this is based on the following poem by Lu Xun. So just to give you a little bit of historical context, in the early 20th century China, China saw seismic changes to its culture, society, and government. And the Republican Revolution of 1911 culminated not only in the fall of the Qing dynasty, but also ushered in China's first experiments with democratic governance. But at the same time, the young nation state was fragile and susceptible to dominance by warlords and factional fighting. So this text is by one of the most recognized pioneers of modern Chinese literature, Lu Xun, and this was his meditation on what traditional China was like. And for him, it's like a tomb for the living. So I'll just read you a little bit from this text. Suppose there is an iron house without any windows and virtually indestructible. Inside are many people sound asleep, about to die of suffocation. Drifting from sleep into oblivion, they won't feel the sorrow of dying. Now, if you cry out and wake a few of the lighter sleepers, making the unfortunate minority suffer the agony of irrevocable death, do you really think you're doing them a good turn? So this metaphor of the iron house is reminiscent of the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic. In one sense, they're similar because it places the privilege of enlightenment on the few. But whereas the enlightened cave dweller in Plato's allegory is blinded by the light outside and is shunned when that person returns to the cave, here the awakened few in Lu Xun's metaphor bear the responsibility of making a decision. And that is whether to wake up others in a call to arms or to stay quiet on the collective journey toward a blissful death. So here, as Lu Xun was meditating on this burden of enlightenment, his friend replied, "But if a few wake up, you can't say there is no hope of destroying the iron house." And Lu Xun's response to that was, "I could not blot out hope, for hope lies in the future." Yet the futurity of hope implies that hope does not exist in the here and now. So elsewhere, Lu Xun would go on and talk about how hope is often a shield of denial that blocks out the onslaught of nihilism. That is to say, because hope is tied to the sense of futurity, you cannot decide whether it exists or not. So in a sense, the antithesis of hope would be nihilism, and hope is basically a way to block out that nihilism. And as China continued to be plagued by disunion at home and imperialist threats from abroad, there were more poems written by poets to talk about that sense of urgency and turmoil. So I wanted to turn to a second poem, but first I'll kind of just give you a distillation of what that message was. Hope, in this case, is conceptualized as a temporal progression translated into spatial relocation. Hope persists along the axis of time in the pursuit of a better place here or elsewhere. And the example of this concept is a poem by Wen Yidol called Dead Water. It's often taught in schools in China as a metaphor for Republican China in its most tumultuous state. So here I just want to present the first and last stanza. This stagnant pool of water gives no hope. A clear breeze cannot raise half a ripple. Why not toss in a few more scraps of metal? Let's throw in bits of leftover food as well. This stagnant pool of water gives no hope. This is where one will never find beauty. Why not give ugliness and evil a chance and see what world they make of it? On the one hand, the poem challenges the limit of Chinese landscape poetry by depicting the grotesque as opposed to the beautiful and the sublime. On the other, I wanted to argue that it symbolizes a Benjaminian gaze at the wreckage of historical time, but with a difference. So in the essay by Walter Benjamin on the concept of history, he talks about the angel of history as a metaphor for a retrospective gaze at the ruins of history. And Pao Clay's artwork here symbolizes the angel of history caught in the wind, moving backwards, but staring at the wreckage of historical time, and it only grows. And so comparing this to Wen Yidol's poem, I would argue that the difference here in the poem is that the gaze is not retrospective but speculative. Rather than describing the status quo, is actually trying to imagine future possibilities. Whereas the wastewater is stagnant, is also a place of creation. So it's not just a place of death, but it's also a place where it could be a breeding ground for organic life. So here, I'm thinking about Benjamin's assessment of Baudelaire's poetry, in which he said, Baudelaire's aesthetics of evil is not the, quote, reprehensible confusion of moral judgment, but the permissible reversal in perception, unquote. So So here, hope lies in the ability of one to look at the status quo, but imagine through interpretation what else is possible. So he's essentially carving space out of the status quo so that the futurity of hope has a place to enter when it does. So finally, I want to wrap up with the third piece here. So as my thinking was evolving, I was thinking, if hope is a set of counterfactual anticipations, is it by nature speculative? What comes after speculative hope? And I was thinking about the antitheses of hope, and led me to think about retrospection as a way to allow us to revisit past hopes with the benefit of historical hindsight. So for example, a retrospective gaze at the ruins of history. This is where I like to bring in a poem by an anonymous detainee at Angel Island. So I visited for the first time in January 2020, and it was a very meaningful but also loaded experience. Even though I had lived in the Bay Area for many years, I was very reluctant to go there because of my own personal background and because of what, I wasn't ready to confront that history. So when it was time for me to confront it, I went, and this is one of the poems I saw there. The people of the Lee household pulled me away. In late summer, I boarded a ship for America. Crossing the ocean, the ship entered the bay, and I waited to go on shore. Despite my record of innocence, I was detained in this wooden building. Thinking about my situation, I feel disgusted and depressed. Writing and composing poems help dispel my worries. At the moment, my case has not been refuted or dismissed. As I give my statement, I feel justified in my anger. In detainment, the months and years go by. This place is like a cage, and I a turtle dove. This poem is one of 200 or so poems recorded through research at the Angel Island immigration station. Just to give you a little bit more background, it was modeled on New York's Ellis Island as a detention center for immigrants awaiting entry to the US. Over 70% of the detainees there were of Chinese descent, many of whom came from the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong province in southern China. But also many other detainees came from places as varied as Japan, Korea, the Philippines, South Asia, and Europe. So it was, even though it's tied to the history of Chinese immigration, it's also a place where migrants overall coming to the West Coast had to stay at. So this poem reminded me of the therapeutic properties of literature, which came to the fore. As the author acknowledges, writing and reading helped alleviate the feelings of anxiety, uncertainty, anger, and boredom. And as I was writing my way through the COVID-19 pandemic, I was reminded of some of these affects. Physical distancing and quarantine measures were imperfect proxies for what this experience of detention might have felt like. However, the detainees here did not have the freedom of movement and very little agency over the situation. So I'm reminded of the privilege that we do have as we're surviving through this ongoing pandemic. And I wanted to show you some of the images I collected when I was at the immigration station as a way to kind of show you what my mental process was like as I browsed through the beds, the furniture, the items on display, and and as I was imagining how detainees were passing time. I won't narrate the images, but I just wanted to, share these images with you and ask you to kind of imagine what it was like to pass the time through conversations, games, needlework, daydreaming, and imagine like art and making art as a way to cope with precarity. So I'm going to pause here to just say a few words. So here's an example of Angel Island poetry carved onto the walls of the dormitories there. And here are two poems. One on the left is written while the supposed author is in detention, and on the right is a reply about someone assumed to be the same author leaving that immigration center. And some of the poems were written in ink with a brush as opposed to carved. The skills of the detainees were diverse. You have literati, people who read and write in classical Chinese, and you have artisans who were able to work with tools to carve these intricate letters into the walls. And the station was taken over later on and no longer used as a detention center. And one of the first things that the people working there did was to plaster over the writings and to paint over them. And here you have some of the paint removed so you can see the layers. But as the paint was removed, it's done in such a way that it aestheticizes that experience and the remnants of that history. There were not only Chinese writing, there were multiple writings and carvings onto the walls that I discovered and presumably created later. For example, you have Tennessee, and you have Cyrillic letters, you have a German instruction saying keep the doors closed, and also a Japanese poem written in Showa 20, so 1946. Not exactly sure if this is the pencil writing that survived so many decades, but that's how it was dated. So these are some buildings for people who were stationed on the island who were not detainees. This is the post office for that population. And I just wanted to show you a screenshot of what it was like to walk through this space. And as you can see, they were not maintained in the same way the detention center itself was. And I saw some deer on the island as well. So the reason why I wanted to end with this image is I wanted to just kind of wrap everything up with two comments. As I was thinking about what after hope means, for me personally, it means preserving a hope for a future past. And by that I mean a future that was in the past but hoped for, but also new ways of understanding that past. And one of the questions also is whether this hope is solely human, a solely human phenomenon. As we contemplate climate change and species extinction, I wanted to also broaden up hope not only for different human populations, but also to include non-human populations, what it means to survive together on this planet. Not just only as representatives of the human population, but also taking into account what was the experience of this deer throughout the centuries or throughout the decades. So with that, I'm going to end the conversation or my presentation and turn it over to my final panelists. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, I'm Asma Kazmi. I'm really excited to be here. I want to thank Janet O, Padma Maitland, and my collaborator, Santhi Kavuri-Bauer, who's going to go after me. So again, I'm Asma Kazmi, and I'm an artist and an educator. And I just want to say a little bit about my practice before I talk about this work after Jahangir. So I work across media, incorporating traditional methods like painting, drawing, sculpture, as well as using new media methodologies like virtual reality and augmented reality in my work. I'm interested in combining virtual and material objects to explore the notion of simultaneity. I think of it as a tug of more than one time and place. where one feels a kind of contrapuntal, decentered experience of the world. My talk today is called Hope After Jahangir, and I'm taking this opportunity to describe a vision of hope that speculates on the future by considering history and the present moment. So for the next 10 minutes, in a nonlinear way, I will draw lessons from the past, while at the same time considering contemporary frameworks based on our material relations to reimagine and recast the future, utilizing my work after Jahangir. So what you see here is a Mughal miniature paint portrait of the Emperor Jahangir. And next to it is a self-portrait that I made holding an Indian mango. And this is a portrait where I was thinking about my longing for this fruit as an immigrant to the United States. And hence this portrait was made. So a little bit about Jahangir. And that's me. So the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who lived from 1569 to 1627, he was given the name World Caesar for his preoccupation with collecting. He was a naturalist who enthusiastically acquired and scientifically recorded plants, animals, minerals, and oddities from different parts of the globe. His collection included costly gemstones, decorative weaponry, textile, rare plants and animals. He acquired these objects during his travels, which happened by land and also by the Indian Ocean. And other objects were given to him like as gifts or traded valuable objects, which he traded with the Safavid Empire in Iran, which was right next to India, and through the Portuguese in Goa. Jahangir recorded, measured, enumerated, and tested his possessions, and he wrote about them in the Jahangirnama, which was his memoir. Here's an image of a turkey that he got from South America, and a zebra from Ethiopia. Both animals he breeded in India. He studied them, and he commissioned his painters to represent them in these paintings. So for Jahangir, bioprospecting was meant to amaze, impress, and project power. However, the art historian Shrigat Ray argues that for the Mughals, accumulation was informed by spectatorial regimes of seeing and ordering the world, rather than eco-colonial domination. During his reign, Jahangir commissioned many portraits where he was often pictured with his arm lifted to his face, holding up an exotic object to ruminate on its properties. Here you see him holding a falcon for a portrait from early 1600s. And here is an unusual, very large speculative portrait where Jahangir is holding a globe with a Western-inspired halo behind his head. Here he's portrayed as the world Caesar. So I've been fascinated by Jahangir's gesture of holding an object close, which reads to me as an embodied enchantment with the material world. What kind of scientist so intimately poses over and over again with the object of their study? What does Jahangir see, hear, smell, taste, feel as he holds these objects? What do these gestures reveal about Jahangir's values? What do they reveal about Jahangir's first-hand, mediated, and imagined experiences with matter? These questions led me to my photographic drawing and sculptural installation called After Jahangir. This work is actually up right now at the Berkeley Arts Center. And in April of this year, I led a workshop for a group of students from Habib University in Karachi. And during the workshop, we studied Islamic Mughal miniature portraits. We made lists of all of our personal possessions, and we reperformed Jahangir's gesture to create a series of images about nature, the built environment, and consumerism. In our reperformance of Jahangir's gesture, we replaced Jahangir's articulations of his refined connoisseurship by our own contemporary consumption habits. Thinking playfully yet critically about consumerism and excessive consumption, we held up overproduced consumer objects like plastics and electronics in our palm to gaze at. To frame our gestures, I created architectural dioramas as fictional monuments to collecting, accumulating, and trashing of stuff. By creating a series of images depicting entanglements of historical representation and placing ourselves within this system, I was interested in imagining new and unique possibilities of thinking about matter, materiality, and the ecology. Here. The sculptural objects that you see in front of the photographs are inspired by a rehel, or an Islamic book holder. And they're holding drawings made of ink, watercolor, and imitation gold leaf. I think I have a detail. The drawings are made to represent Mughal manuscripts, and each one contains a single image of a mass-produced object surrounded by gold leaf frames. These drawings, displayed on a non-Western apparatus, invite the viewer to think about the manifold intellectual and artistic traditions, the ancestor technologies and knowledge that people used during colonial and pre-colonial times to express their cultural, historical, scientific, and conceptual frameworks. I'm interested in pointing to those ancient knowledge systems to think about cultural exchange, appropriation, acculturation, and progress that led to the advancements in art and science in the West. Moreover, I'm interested in establishing a non-Western reading practice where one has to bend over low to the ground or sit down on the floor to read a drawing. In the Islamic tradition, this kind of interaction with an artwork allowed the viewer to understand the formal and conceptual aspects of the work, but also revealed the agency of the pigments and ground minerals on the surface of the painting in the form of mineral flares, which accounted for the material, discursive, and historical origins of the work through a sensuous enchantment with an object. Jahangir's portraits represent an ancient, non-Western, and Islamic form of ecological, spatial, and material awareness. This awareness was complicated since it enabled record-keeping and preservation, but it was also hierarchical, patriarchal, and it was a show of power, as I mentioned before. My reperforming and embodiment of Jahangir's gesture is an eco-feminist critique, an intervention, and an act of reading backward Mughal dynastic projections of power. It's an attempt of forming an alliance with objects instead of depicting them as property. As I assimilate and subsume Jahangir's gesture, I'm interested in engendering in the participants and viewers of the work questions and ideas about hopeful, non-hierarchical, and non-exploitative commitments for relating to matter and the material world. I think I will end there. I think that is my last slide. Thank you so much.
and I also want to thank Janet and Padma for inviting me, and to Asma, whose work just constantly and consistently inspires me to think about Islamic art in different ways, and in terms of the past, but also the future. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know who mentioned it before, but a little strange to be in front of people again, so please excuse me if I hiccup here. Yeah, so my talk is called Hope in After Jahangir. That was the project that Asma just introduced us to. And the matter of his jade cups, which belong in they are in this museum, and they're actually on view, so if you're interested, you can go and see them. Hope, when it's directed outward to community, is utopian. It is a mode of imagining new and unprecedented solutions for a better future, which are at once practical and impossible. It is this ambivalent realm of the present and the future that utopian art inhabits. Thomas More's early modern novel Utopia, is often cited as the first aesthetic expression of this utopian modality, formed in the space between the material realities of 16th century Europe and an imagined land that is both a good and no place. In the history of Western utopian thought, a line of progression is traced from More's seminal novel to the utopias born out of the Enlightenment project. These include the primitivist utopia based in the Americas and the industrial utopia that followed from their European settlement. Industrial utopia, with its belief in the future promise of science and the market economy, as well as the credo of individualism, has influenced an extractive orientation toward matter. In industrial utopias, utopian art meets a dead end when it comes to mattering for a good society. Transformed to spectacle and commodity, and celebrated as symbols of freedom, art today can be and do anything but matter. To save utopian thinking in art, new approaches to the study of our material realities have emerged. These are found in the writings of new materialism and post-humanism, both systems of thought premised on the idea of decentering the human and recognizing the inherent agency of matter. They make room for illiberal, as opposed to liberal humanist orientations with the world, as well as allow for a re-enchantment with matter, and knowledge systems that are disconnected from Western humanism's teleology of progress and its extractive disposition toward matter. Artists and art historians, motivated by new materialism and post-humanist critique, have come to be reinvested in the view of art objects as having agency. Artists are thinking about the hidden, uncanny, connected histories and subjectivities that can be revealed through their works. Art historians, using the rhetoric and logic of post-humanist discourse and its concepts of the contingent, nomadic, and rhizomatic potentiality of an artwork, are beginning to write a new kind of art history centered on the aesthetic encounter with the art object. Art reframed as objects that matter in this way, that continually reproduce themselves for each new period of human history, means to appreciate them in their radical openness to utopian futures. For the remaining time, I want to return to Asma's work after Jahangir and how it operates to orient our relationships to objects and infuse them with hope. While her work is inspired by contemporary eco-feminist discourses, I believe that with her choices of framing and iterating the physical presentation of objects in the mode of Mughal paintings, she draws connections with the hope found in Islamic metaphysics and aesthetics. More precisely, using motifs and gestures of the Mughal material past, her work indicates alternative practices of collecting and orienting ourselves in the material world. She does this with the use of the keel and cusped arches to frame the individuals, and by depicting their posture and hold on the objects in the same ceremonial manner as Emperor Jahangir. As Sarah Ahmed explains the strategy of this focus on orientation to enliven the object. Orientations might shape how matter matters. If matter is affected by orientations by the way in which bodies are directed toward things, it follows that matter is dynamic, unstable, and contingent. The arch is derived from Mughal period architecture and painting serve to aesthetically rehearse a method of orienting the subject with the object that redirects people and things to Islamic phenomenology, or knowledge derived from sensual experience with form and matter. Through their courtly education in the 11th century philosophy of Avicenna and his 12th century respondent Nasr-ud-Din al-Tusi, the Mughals learned of the potentiality of matter that becomes activated in the aesthetic encounter with the art object. Jahangir's collection of objects and his representation of himself holding them are both articulations of this aesthetic encounter and the intellectual and spiritual power derived from it. To have the same orientation repeated today in the context of Karachi, Pakistan, opens up the objects held by the participants to unforeseen connections with the past and with the future. It makes us aware of the entanglements of history, centers the contingency of matter, and makes our relationship with objects change in new and hopeful ways. The hope that is embedded in the held object in Asma's After Jahangir functions in the same way as Donna Haraway's Oddkin, forging new and unpredictable kinships that can be formed beyond the usual genealogical, ethnocentric, anthropocentric relations. The post-humanist mode of looking to past practices of Islamic collecting and ordering can also be applied to museological objects, like the two famous examples of Mogul Jade in the collection of the Asian Art Museum. The first is a cup made in the workshops of the Mughals' ancestor, Timur, and collected by Jahangir. The second is shaped like a gourd with a Persian inscription that reads, "Drink at the command of God." Besides being beautifully carved, the cups were valued for their material, jade, which was thought to protect against poisoning. Thus, their form and the sorry, should have brought my water up here. Thus, their form and the Mughals' belief in their apotropaic qualities make the cups signs of the contingent nature of matter. I hope you all got that. So the Mughals believed that jade had this inherent quality to be protective and also good for the kidneys. And they may have been getting that information also from China. And it's interesting, too, that the Chinese collected some of Jahangir's jades because they revered the carving. So there's always this movement of jade in Asia that we really don't take account of. So yeah, the apotropaic qualities make the cup signs of the contingent nature of matter, whose form, released by the artisans, were thought worth collecting by an intellectually gifted ruler. In the imperial collection, the cups held a special place in the hierarchy of things and represented the ruler's unique ability to perceive the active intellect, and that's with capital letters. The active intellect was also known as God, that permeates all matter and forms. So through the act of collecting and showcasing his knowledge of the order of things, Jahangir was representing his correspondence with the active intellect and his ability to perceive the object's place among all other contingent forms in his empire. So reorienting our view of these cups to this history and ontology means to see their contingent and relational value within the larger matrix of Islamic power and knowledge. It also means we realize that the cups belong to a category of wondrous objects due to the magical nature and ability to astonish. using the Mughal architectural frame of the arch to bring attention to the hope in the contingently mattering nature of everyday objects, Asma's project opens the possibility to converse in alternative ways with the past and reorient ourselves with objects in our present. Through her work, we are encouraged to find new relationships with the things that matter, where the hidden, mystical, and enchanting qualities of objects are allowed to be appreciated for the hope they can give in our everyday encounters. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I feel like there's a lot to process from that, and there's kind of a poetry how we went from literature and record keeping to objects and even objects in our collection. So thank you all for that. We are running a little bit behind, so I do have a couple of questions for you. We've been hearing earlier through presentations yesterday, today, and even through this, that hope is relational. That's something that we've been hearing a lot. We've been talking about how hope is relational in terms of gesture, like we saw in your work, Asma, in time with objects, and also even record keeping or ourselves or other beings like animals, like Christopher, like you mentioned. How do you propose that we can orient ourselves towards objects in this contemporary age? It's a big question.
I can start. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that question a lot through this work, and I think, you know, as I mentioned in my talk, I've been just examining the things around me, and I've been looking at my parents' collection of objects in Pakistan. You know, I get to see them every 2 years sometimes, and their house sort of keeps exploding with stuff. And so I've been thinking about why that is, and you know, what do these objects represent to them? You know, what is this sort of impulse of holding on to things, and especially as, you know, as people who've been sort of refugees from India, Afghanistan, you know, as an immigrant to the United States myself. So, you know, and so there's a tendency in the West with, you know, these shows about sort of hoarding and accumulation, where we think of that as a negative thing. And, you know, I've been sort of trying to get myself to look at my mom's collection in a more generous way, and, you know, and I think there's something inherently sort of there's something in her where she just values things a lot differently than we're taught to sort of believe. You know, as things are disposable and can be thrown away, even if they're not precious and plastic and sort of trinkety. So there, I think it's in this idea of sort of re-understanding and reorienting myself towards a kind of gentleness towards my parents that I've been, you know, thinking about this notion. It's a really sort of personal and long-winded way to answer your question, but perhaps, yeah, it talks about my own experience.
Yeah, the personal is definitely one of them, but you know, taking from, you know, the question was about relationships and how to think about different ways of relating to matter, and it's definitely to get away from the extractive, value-oriented way of looking and collecting, and again, like looking at the object for the aesthetic encounter. Or the pleasure it gives, and that could open up in productive ways into all kinds of new stories and narratives and other relationships, past, present, and future. So it's just about getting away from that dynamic, market-driven, of course, and egocentric way of thinking of how we operate with objects, and giving that value of agency to objects will help.
I think, can you hear me? Okay, great. I think it's important to also historicize when exactly the idea of the object emerged. So I'm thinking about, my own training in philosophy, with starting with Kant and his turn to the subject, which in turn emphasized its opposite, which is the object, and following after that Hegel and materialist readings of Hegel. So that would be kind of like one of the moments that the object emerged as the opposition to the subject. But then also thinking more in, say, Confucian terms, Confucianism was really more about kinship. It's about human relationships more so than objects. So the object is actually not as important in that context. But they're often used in other systems of thought. In China, for example, Taoism and Buddhism, where the boundaries between object and subject are not as clear-cut. For example, through reincarnation or through Taoist allegories, that use objects to explain the way of nature. So I think, in this moment where, at least in academia, the humanities and critical theory, where we are turning more and more to the theories of objects, that it's important to also think about historically how we thought about objects. Why in this moment do we care so much more about objects? And also, what are some progressive ways of thinking about objects that would include rethinking how we've always thought about members of our society, but also how we could include other members into this, assemblage. So, and here I would like to, push it further, not only along the lines of, say, intersectional analysis, but also to really think about what the non-human would be. Like, when we think about climate, non-human animals, and so forth, and material elements. So I think that's where the art museum is such a great place to talk about the object, because we have a wonderful collection of examples to focus our attention on.
I actually want to ask you all, because you're not in museums, and we are in a museum. Santhi, you mentioned something about revealing subjectivities through objects. I'm just wondering, do any of you have thoughts on how we can better relate to objects in a museum as people not working in museums? I'm kind of curious about that.
It's the guided tour that maybe could be a good place to develop new narratives around the object. So instead of going from the usual, this is the beginning of humankind, like in an encyclopedic museum, and moving in that way from the distant past to the more recent past, or also dividing the world into cultures, you can get the audience to make their own trips, make their own interesting and confusing and playful tours. open it up in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, I think that images are intertextual, and images refer to other images that were created before them, and objects refer to other objects that came before. And so I think museums can perhaps do a better job of perhaps placing an object in relation to a poetic text, or something that does more than point to and acknowledge where something came from and what period, but rather referring to more sort of like a broader discourse of things talking to each other in relation.
I love wandering through museums because, in addition to the guided tour and the docents, because I feel like it's a narrative-making process. And, I'm always happy to learn about the narratives that I should learn more about, because I'm not familiar with the objects, but also I kind of think about how, pragmatically, do I make a left turn or a right turn, and that in itself is part of the narrative that, subconsciously we're creating. And I think maybe just highlighting that process a little bit more and maybe bringing it back to, a conversation will kind of create new avenues for, relating to the object in ways that are more personal.
See a future collaboration, literature and objects. On that note, I think we've run out of time, but I want to thank you all again for your wonderful presentations. We are going to take a short break, about an hour, and we'll reconvene back at 1 o'clock in the hall. Thank you so much.